Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. On Wednesday and Thursday of this week, top PRC diplomat Wang Yi and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Vienna for, quote, 2 days of candid, substantive and constructive talks, end quote, in the words of the White House. In the current bilateral environment, which is at its worst place in decades, the fact that 2 days of meetings happened at all is a positive sign for at least basic stability in the relationship. In the White House statement, the US side expressed, quote, 2 sides agreed to maintain this important strategic channel of communication to advance these objectives, building on the engagement between President Joe Biden and President Xi in Bali, Indonesia, in November 2022. End quote. According to state-run Xinhua, the Chinese side expressed, quote, the 2 sides held discussions on removing obstacles in China-US relations and stabilizing the relationship from deterioration. Both sides agreed to continue to make good use of this strategic communication channel. End quote. Outside of these statements, very few details have been published regarding the over 8 hours of discussions. Some US commentators are hoping that this will pave the way for a Xi-Biden call and or a visit by Secretary of State Blinken. Whether this happens is unclear, and indeed these meetings appear to have become politicized bargaining chips in the relationship. Multiple reports in Western media claim that China has been reluctant to agree to a visit from Blinken because it was concerned that the US FBI plans to release a report about the Chinese balloon following its analysis of the debris salvaged off the coast of South Carolina. This week, UK-based Reuters reports that after the balloon saga earlier this year, quote, the US State Department held back human rights-related sanctions, export controls, and other sensitive actions to try to limit damage to the China-US relationship, according to 4 sources with direct knowledge of US policy, as well as internal emails. End quote. Yesterday, UK-based Financial Times reports, too, that Beijing told Washington that it was unwilling to schedule a meeting between the PRC defense minister and his US counterpart, Lloyd Austin, when the 2 officials attend the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Forum in Singapore this June. Minister Li was sanctioned by the United States in 2018 in relation to Chinese imports of Russian arms when he was serving as a general. He became defense minister in March. Several people told the outlet that, quote, it would be almost impossible for China to agree to a meeting while they remain in place, end quote. If these reports are accurate, that is to say, if any would-be meeting between high officials are politicized bargaining chips, the question arises, why is the US still pushing for meetings? One reason is suggested in a Bloomberg report published yesterday. The US-based financial media outlet writes, citing unnamed sources, that the US has been pursuing meetings with the PRC, quote, to appease allied nations in Asia and Europe that are anxious the US isn't doing enough to ease tension that some fear could lead to an open conflict, end quote. This approach has divided commentators in Washington, however. Quote, this is a smart but risky play. It looks credible to Europe and Asia, but it also risks reinforcing China's view that we need them more and they can drive the US-China agenda, end quote. And indeed, if the US agrees not to publish the FBI report on the Chinese balloon shot down over US territory in exchange for what should be a routine diplomatic exchange between the 2 most important nations in the world, it is hard to argue that Beijing would not read this as a sign of their relative strength versus the US. Others disagree, however. Quote, more intensive diplomacy is necessary to reduce the growing risk of a crisis that neither side seeks at a time of acute domestic challenges. Diplomacy is not a gift to the other side, but an indispensable tool for tackling problems, end quote. We should note that the Chinese side, through state media and official statements, has framed this dynamic differently. Yesterday, Thursday, People's Republic of China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin articulated the official Beijing position. Quote, what matters is that the US cannot keep raising the issue of communication on the one hand, while on the other, keep suppressing and containing China. The US cannot say one thing but do another. We urge the US to form a correct perception of China, respect China's red lines, stop undermining China's sovereignty, security and development interests, and work with China in the same direction to bring bilateral relations back on the track of sound and stable growth." End quote. Within the PRC itself, the anti-US narrative environment remains highly acute. On Wednesday, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted a tweet accusing the US military of developing bioweapons to target ethnically Chinese people. We will continue to follow China-US relations going forward. Next up, the Chinese economy, and we have yet more disappointing data. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. There were several important releases of economic numbers this week. We need to now move through some of the most salient. The National Bureau of Statistics released official data on urban wages in 2022. And some of the findings and the numbers have raised concerned eyebrows. According to the data, average salaries in China rose at their weakest pace in over a decade. For the non-private sector, the increase in average pay last year was the weakest since data became available in 2001. More than one Chinese analyst has used terms like crash and collapse to describe wage growth. What's more, employees in the far less productive non-private sector earned around 75% more than people working in private sector companies last year. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes that in nominal terms, pay growth at non-private sector companies slowed to 6.7% last year from 9.7% in 2021 and slumped to 3.7% from 8.9% in privately owned companies. After taking inflation into account, the gains were just 4.6% and 1.7% respectively, according to the outlet. The wage gap between non-private sector and private sector workers has been widening since 2008, the global financial crisis, and also the beginning of China's massive stimulus campaign, the fallout from which continues to this very day. The non-private sector mostly includes governments, public institutions like universities, and state-owned enterprises. Most industries saw at least some growth in wages, with IT and finance leading the pack. Unsurprisingly though, the real estate sector saw average salaries drop in 2022. Economists point out that what matters for rebalancing the economy is the growth in total household income, not just wages, relative to GDP growth. Based on the official numbers, wage growth in the private sector last year came in well below the GDP growth rate, with the non-private sector just meeting the rate. This week's official consumer inflation numbers also disappointed. In April, non-food prices inched up 0.1%, softening from the 0.3% growth we saw in March. Food prices retreated from the 2.4% increase a year ago to 0.4% last month. Producer deflation also deepened last month, with the Producer Price Index, PPI, dropping 3.6% year-on-year in April, down for a 7th consecutive month. While much of the developed West is currently trying to get inflation under control, China, in need of more consumption, is trying to do the opposite, keeping inflation from falling below healthy levels. These deflationary signals suggest domestic demand is still frail, and Beijing may decide that more stimulus may be needed. But if more stimulus is needed, we need to look at the already concerning levels of debt. On this point, we learned this week too that China's total social financing, a proxy for total debt, rose by 1.22 trillion RMB in April, less than expected after a record first quarter. Data published by the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, yesterday, Thursday, showed that Chinese banks extended over 700 billion yuan in new yuan loans in April, less than a fifth of March's tally and just over half of the amount expected by Reuters analysts. This is quite a surprising development, but when added to the first 3 months, the average rate of increase is still very high. Quote, Total social financing has increased in the first 4 months of 2023 by nearly 16 trillion RMB, an amount equal to 41% of the period's GDP. It's good to see that the growth in debt is slowing, but this is still an extraordinarily high amount of new debt. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.